So Dr. Balanoff, how long did the process take from when you first were approached with the idea of doing this until the point where you were ready to manufacture and get it out to the public?
That process is a lot more complicated and complex than most people think. And probably from start to finish, it probably took us about 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot involved. So let's kind of talk through some of the steps. So the first thing, of course, is identifying the problem. And then you have to invent an appliance that you want to study. And then you invent this appliance. And that's what we did. So we ended up taking a lot of very common dental materials that have all been cleared by the FDA to be used orally. No one's ever put that combination of materials together. So we had to kind of figure out a manufacturing process for that. So that takes a couple of months of, just playing around in the lab. And it's actually really a lot of fun to do that. And lucky for me, I've got a lot of talented lab technicians. And between my background in chemistry and their background in manufacturing techniques, we come to this appliance. And then we start to develop the intellectual property for that, which is the actual design of it. And there's like certain things prosthetically that we kind of took into account, which is the person's tongue, the person's cheek, opening the vertical dimension, all of the kind of things that you would want to do. And then we had to figure out, how many patients do we need to study in order to have statistical significance. So for example, if we studied one person and they had an amazing improvement wearing our appliance, is one person enough to make a broad generalization for an entire population? And without even understanding statistics, you say, well, probably one is not enough. So then you ask the question, well, is 2 enough? Or is 3 enough? How many patients do we know? And there's these statistical algorithms that you can kind of go through, and based upon the amount of change that you're looking for, you can figure out the number of patients to decide this. So they have these things called confidence levels, and usually in these research studies, you want to have a confidence level of 95%. So what does that mean? It means that if you were to run this experiment 100 times, 95% of the time, you would get this particular result. Okay? So then you start backing into the numbers, which is how many patients do you need to study, and what's the amount of variation that you need to see in order for this to mean something. And at the same time, we had to figure out, well, if we were to put anything inside a child or an adult's mouth, would this thing called sensory deception occur? So for example, if we were to put a pencil on their mouth, or a piece of gum, or a regular run-of-the-mill night guard or mouth guard, would that be enough to distract them from them wanting to have the urge to tick? So the study was designed as this. We needed to know how many ticks per 2 minutes the child had at the beginning, and then we make an appliance for them, a regular run-of-the-mill night guard, and we let them wear that for a week, and we see whether or not the ticks have gone down. And then we make a specially designed tick appliance by changing the vertical dimension, and we measure the number of ticks again. So from nothing to a night guard to a specially designed appliance, we start to measure all of those data points, and we start to see if it really makes a difference. And what we learned in our study, and before you actually start these studies, you go to the Food and Drug Administration and you request a meeting with their dental division, and you present your research plan and your research idea and what you're trying to prove or not prove. And the FDA is probably one of those few organizations in the world that you're better off asking permission than forgiveness. They're really not much for forgiveness. They want to know exactly what you're doing, and they're more than happy to cooperate with you up front. Just ask permission. So you prepare a lot of paperwork, and then you have a call with them, and you tell them what you want to do, and you explain the statistical idea that you have, and they either approve or disapprove it. So in our particular case, they approved it without modification, which was stunning, doesn't typically happen, and then off we go. So now we have this study design, we have these appliances, and now we have to pick somebody objective to do the study. Because if I were to do the study, and I was intimately involved in the day-to-day research, then somebody can make the claim, well, of course, you're going to pick a particular type of patient, you're going to skew the results. So we needed to make it objective. So I go to the University of Tennessee Dental School and the dean at the time was Tim Hoddle, somebody who I known professionally for many, many years, and I pitched him on the idea, and he said, great. So he was going to become the lead investigator. So getting the dean of a major United States dental school was a big deal. And then we decided that we were going to have a second study site, which would have been in Long Island. So now we've got a team of doctors in Memphis, Tennessee, a team of doctors in Long Island, different patients, different geography. Those two are not seeing each other on a regular basis. And the data that we'd be able to garnish from that research would be statistically so much more impressive, because you're just not dealing with one doctor in one geographic location who may be a really talented doctor. You've got different doctors in different locations, dealing with different patient populations. So now we have to get permission to actually do the study, not only on adults, but on children. So there's a thing called the IRB, Institutional Review Board, and you have to propose to them what you want to do. So in our particular case, we explained to the IRB what we want to do, and some of the requests that we had is we wanted to take a CBCT, which is a cone beam computerized tomography X-ray, so that we can look at them skeletally, and we can maybe find out why they have particular skeletal and dental orthognathic relationships, and that would be something that we would want to add to our study. So the University of Tennessee IRB, they reviewed and approved everything. That process takes about 2 months, sometimes longer, but we had everything and we were squeaky clean. They approve it, and off we go when we start doing the study. So the hard part at that point is calibration of the study teams, both in Tennessee and Long Island. So that required a meeting. So everybody had to fly to Tennessee, and we had to calibrate everybody so that everybody knew what was going to be done. And then we have to start to recruit patients. And that became really the most difficult part of the study, which is recruiting patients. Now, it turns out that my friend back in New York, Craig Carton, who actually started the foundation, who was able to, do the fundraising for the study, and the study cost about $300,000.
Wow.
It's expensive.
Yeah.
So he had to raise a lot of money for this to happen. He raises the money, and it turns out that he's friends with Dr. Phil.
Oh.
Yeah, from CBS. So he tells Dr. Phil about the study that we're doing, and we need to raise, we need to garnish more patients for the study. So Dr. Phil is the producer of the Doctors show on CBS. So Dr. Phil makes arrangements for Craig and I to be on the Doctors show. So we fly out to California, and CBS treats us like, we're rock stars, and we film a segment on the Doctors show. And that segment brought awareness to the study that we were doing, and we got a flood of patients afterwards. And in fact, we got so many patients that I probably had to turn away over 100 patients that wanted to participate in the study.
Wow.
So we realized that there was a market out there for this type of research. We do the study, it takes us about a year. We have to work with a statistician to make sure that everything is correct. And at the end of the day, this is what we found out, that an appliance placed inside a patient's mouth, a mouth guard or a night guard or something along those lines, is not going to change the tick count significantly. So sensory deception is not something real, and that was not helping reduce the number of ticks. When we used our tag appliance, we called it the Tick Active Guard, it turns out that it becomes statistically significant, and we can reduce ticks, both motor and vocal ticks. Motor ticks are like shoulder shrugging, eye blinking, turning your head. Vocal ticks are clearing your throat, or in very rare occasions, when they blurt out words. That we can reduce both motor and vocal ticks in mild to moderate patients with Tourette syndrome and chronic tic disorder by about 40%.
Wow.
Big deal.
Yeah.
Non-pharmaceutical, non-invasive, non-surgical. And so now we have to take all of that research data, and we have to do two different things to it. We have to get it published in a peer-reviewed journal, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then we also wanted to submit it to the FDA for 510K clearance. The document submitted to the FDA for 510K clearance was almost 200 pages long.
Wow.
It's a lot of writing. It's months and months worth of writing. And then to submit it to a peer-reviewed journal, I decided I wanted to submit it to a medical journal. So I submitted to the Journal of Pediatric Neurology, and they write me back within a couple of days, and they basically say, we have no idea what you're talking about. We don't understand the dental component to this, and quite frankly, we're not even really sure if the neurologic component that you described in your introduction and summary are really kind of what's going on. We just don't know. So since we can't really judge this article in its whole, we think that you submitted schistosits someplace else. So I was thinking, well, this is pediatric neurologists. I mean, this is like their bailiwick. But because there was a dental component to it, they didn't really get it. And in fact, the neurologists that I worked with at University of Tennessee, who were wonderful people, they didn't really kind of understand all that we understood as dentists. They didn't understand an oral appliance. They didn't understand a class 2 Div 1 orthodontic skeletal relationship. And they didn't even realize that Tourette syndrome starting at age 6 was the beginning of facial skeletal growth. And in women with Tourette syndrome, it typically ended at their first menstrual cycle, which is the end of facial skeletal growth. So typically around 14, 15 years old in girls. And in boys, Tourette syndrome, in 50% of the cases, would end at the end of their facial skeletal growth, which is usually 18 to 21. So it begins at facial skeletal growth. 50% of the time it ends at facial skeletal growth. It occurs in class 2 Div 1 patients, and none of the neurology or medical community ever realized this stuff until the study. So they're like stunned by the whole thing. But no one really understands why it's all happening. Mm-hmm. We eventually submit the paper that I wrote to Compendium, which is the 4th largest peer-reviewed dental journal, and they published it. And they published it a couple of years ago. I forgot the exact date. So it's published and it's there and it's all peer-reviewed and so forth. And everything was submitted to the FDA. They ultimately did not approve it because they wanted sensitivity test done on the plastic material that we used. So individually, each of those pieces of plastic had been approved by the FDA. They had never been approved in combination together. So those tissue sensitivity tests would have cost the nonprofit foundation, which was funding this, another $100,000, and they just quite frankly ran out of money. What I did is I took all of that intellectual property that I developed, the patent application, the 510K, and the paper submitted for peer review publishing, and I donated all of it to the Tourette Association of America. So they have all of it. So that's kind of where it all sits.